Welcome all, and thanks for joining us on this Hangout sponsored by Religion News Service and Google. I'm Brian Pellet, Director of Global Strategy at Religion News Service, and I'll be moderating today's panel. For those of you who might not know, Religion News Service is a non-sectarian, non-profit newswire that delivers breaking news, analysis, and commentary to more than 100 media subscribers around the world. You might have seen some of our bylines in the Washington Post, Huffington Post, USA Today, and then also on our website, which attracts more than 1 million visitors each month. That's religionnews.com. RNS is part of the Religion Newswriters Foundation, which provides educational tools and training for journalists covering religion, both in offline workshops and then also online at our sister site, religionlink.com. At the end of this, we'll be posting a recorded version of this conversation on both sites. So on to today's discussion. At RNS, we're currently working on a series of stories that deal with how individuals and groups combat religious intolerance and hate speech online. Today we'll be discussing how media professionals from across the globe moderate online comments when religious hatred and intolerance come into play. We'll also be looking at what steps these and other news organizations take to uphold freedom of expression when moderating comments, and then hopefully we'll come up with some consensus on the best practice to strike this balance between hate speech and freedom of expression. So on to the panelists. I'm currently in Chicago, but usually I'm based between London and Cape Town. At the bottom, I'll click on the individuals. We've got Tom Hennigan, who is the religion editor at Reuters in Paris. We've got my colleague Kevin Ekstrom, who's editor-in-chief at Religion News Service in Washington, D.C. We've got Darshini Kandasamy, who's the former assistant news editor at Malaysia Kini in Kuala Lumpur, and she'll soon be freelancing from the region. And Tiffany Stanley, managing editor at Religion and Politics in Washington, D.C. And then Aidan White, director of the Ethical Journalism Network in London, and he's currently joining us from Kiev. Cherian George was meant to join us as well. He's an associate professor of journalism at Hong Kong Baptist University, but unfortunately he wasn't able to join us. He did send along a comment that I'll mention if we get time later on. So with all of that, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for being here.
Hi.
Let's quickly start. Aidan, I think I have a question specifically for you. Let's start with some stats. So in a recent study of more than 100 news outlets, the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers found that stories about religion are often the most commented on, but that the quality of those comments is often the worst. Because you're not with a specific news organization right now and deal more with some of the ethical sides of things, what do you think it is about religion that draws such hostile and at times offensive, hateful comments?
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised at all by the findings of the WANIFA report. I mean, in a way, it's obvious that people who are writing about religion have to be very, very careful, because very often what they're dealing with are issues which, to many people, are intensely personal. They're very much about core beliefs that they have. And they also touch on questions of identity and questions of community. So I'm not surprised at all that you will find people who will be impulsive in commenting about journalism, for example, that they disagree with, or report on issues that they disagree with that are to do with their faith or associated with their religion. So I think it is a very, very tricky area. And the fact of the matter is that when we talk about hate speech, which is about the problem of intense hatred, which are where the intention of the speech is to generate intense hatred, or even worse, to incite violence. And we see the problem of religion and the discussion of religion, an area where there has been a tendency very often to intense hatred and for polarization to take place, and unfortunately for acts of violence to follow. So it's not surprising that for media and for journalists, it's a really tricky area, and that's why actually many media tend to turn off comments altogether. That particularly when they're reporting on issues where they know they're likely to trigger a very strong response from one side or another.
That's interesting. I know that quite a few publications are doing that, and it was also mentioned in that report. I think it might be useful to quickly get a sense of how each of the panelists who are currently at news organizations, how those organizations go about moderating these comments that walk the line between full-on offensive hate speech and maybe need to be preserved for freedom of expression issues. Tiffany, can you run us through how religion and politics deals with some of these issues in terms of your maybe community guidelines, terms of use, whether or not you allow anonymous commenters? Just a quick overview of how you do it there.
Sure. Well, Religion and Politics, we're an online-only journal, and when we were launching, comments were a big factor that we were trying to consider what would be our best practice, because the center where we're based out of in Washington University in St. Louis really values civility in these conversations. So we thought, how do we bring that into comments that can get really nasty? So I chose to go with a system on our WordPress site called Disqus, which I've really loved since we launched about 2 years ago. I think it works really great. It flags some comments for me, kind of spammers and things like that, and so will notify me if something pops up. It also takes away some of the anonymity because people have to log into the system and actually use their real email address. A lot of people choose to use their full name. Some people use a username, but I think because it takes a little more effort to comment, we tend to have a higher level of commenting. I do, because we're a smaller niche publication, I'm sort of able to monitor comments a lot better than probably really large news organizations. So for better or for worse, I actually get an email every time someone comments, and so when the comments get in the hundreds, it's a really annoying system. But it allows me to just kind of scan through and see if there's anything I need to flag. Most of the time, I tend to go with the sort of American perspective that all speech is protected. So unless there's some profanity or name calling or things like that, I tend to let things slide. And there's a lot of self-policing that happens in our community, folks kind of talking to each other like, well, that wasn't a very smart comment, like, what are you talking about? And so I think the level of discourse on our site tends to be pretty good. So that's sort of the brief overview.
Interesting. Tom, I know Reuters is probably much larger. I don't think you'd be able to moderate every single comment there. How do you go about it at Reuters?
We had two phases when we started blogging and started taking comments on news stories. First, it started around 2007, and it was dive into the pool at the deep end because we didn't know too much, what this blogging was about and what interactive sort of journalism would be like. But the editors were interested, so anybody who wanted to start up a blog was told, okay, start it up. The global online desk, which is in Toronto, was given the task of doing the initial moderation. So anything they saw that was not profane, was not polemical, overly polemical or anything, they would just click on it. If they had something where they had a question, and with religion there are very often questions, is this acceptable or not, then they would get to me and I would have to moderate it. And we were given general guidelines, civility, nothing libelous, etc. But in the beginning it was quite open. What we found, of course, was that there were far too many comments, just like Tiffany was saying. You couldn't deal with them. And we sort of went with the flow for a few years, but then decided, no, let's have a big overhaul of this. And around 2009 or 10, they overhauled the system and made it much more organized. First of all, filters were put in, so anything with obscenity was immediately dumped, or anything that was using. Very often, for example, we would find words that would be slightly changed, so try to get obscenity past the filter. That would be just chucked as well. Then there was also the registration for users. They were allowed to use a pseudonym, but they did have to have an email address. And you'd have to register. And then a system was put in to say a registered user that immediately opens up a profile in the system for that user, and you then get points for example, how many contributions you've made that are accepted, how many have been rejected, how many have been taken down after a complaint of abuse. And so for all the positive ones, you get a point. For the negative ones, you lose a point. After a while, and it was never told to the users when that cutting off point would come, you could rise to the level of recognized user. Recognized user actually gets posted immediately because they say, no, you've had a good track record. But you can lose that. If you start to get abusive and get too many complaints, you lose it again. Only after that, once those recognized users' posts have been posted, then the Global Online Desk moderators look at the other ones that are left over. They check through those and click through everything they think, and only then will they leave some questionable ones for the editor of the specific blog. That reduced the number enormously because there was a lot more control over it.
Those are probably the trickier ones as well to make judgment calls on, and we'll ask for a few examples of difficult decisions you've had to make in deciding whether or not to block or leave a comment. Darshini, how did Malaysia Kini go about this when you were there?
Well, for Malaysia Kini, we work behind a paywall, so only if you're a subscriber can you post any comments. So although they're allowed to use a nickname, they have to be registered with us, so we know who they are. We have their emails. We know exactly who they are. So each reader is, of course, responsible. We have a small team of editors who go through. So, you know, in a year we get like 200,000 comments. So that's a lot. So how we do it is more of a teamwork basis. So aside the editors and the sub-editors that go through the comments of a story in any given day, you have the reporters themselves. You know, they monitor their own stories, and then they'll send us an email or a call and say, look, there's some offensive comments, whether it's abusive or seditious or, you know, religiously offensive, or even, you know, our CEO or our HR executive, they will send an email saying, look, there's a story. So we all help keep each other in check. And even our readers, I think they've reached a level of maturity where they sort of keep each other in check. And as what Tiffany will say, like, look, this is not a cool comment. What do you mean by this? Or if it's really bad, they will send us an email saying, look, this particular user has been, you know, has a habit of saying something like this, and we will give them a warning. A few warnings, and you run the risk of getting banned. On our end, if someone is offensive, if it's mildly offensive, we will just hide the comment. But if it's really bad, or if this particular user has a history of just making religiously offensive comments or seditious comments, then we will issue a warning. Our subscription office will send an email saying, look, you've been banned for a month. If this goes on, then you risk being banned permanently.
Okay. Kevin, why don't you give us a rundown of how we do things at RNS?
So users are required to register with the site. Sounds like everybody else's, and they have to provide their email address and all that. They can use pseudonyms, and that's something that we have talked about possibly changing. I think there are pluses and minuses. But once people are on the site and they're hopefully contributing to the discussion, we have somebody who works for us full-time. It's not their full-time job, but we have a member of staff who moderates the comments and looks at every single one of them. And if there's anything that is, let's say somebody uses a swear word or profanity in a comment, but the rest of the comment is, you know, substantively fine, they have a point that they're trying to make, he'll actually go in and change that and change it from a four-letter word to a expletive deleted kind of language, so that the substance of the comment remains, but the offensive material has been taken out. If there are judgment calls that he can't quite decide, you know, how offensive or how over the line a particular comment is, they'll kick it up to me, and basically I will measure it up against our user agreement policy, which bans a number of things, but obscenity, indecency, offensive language, what else do we have? Anything that is defamatory, abusive, bullying, harassing, racist, hateful, violent, ethnic slurs, religious intolerance, homophobia, or personal attacks. So if one of these questionable comments runs afoul of any of that, we will delete the comment. Sometimes the commenters will notice that, and they'll say, hey, why'd you delete my comment? And we'll say, well, this is the user agreement that you agreed to, and you're in violation. And oftentimes, folks will kind of move to correct their ways. If it's a repeat offender, and there are a handful of these that are known to us as sort of our problem children, we will ban them from the site. And I suppose they could always re-register under a different email and different username, but we try to give people a little grace in if they stray over the lines, but if they are repeat offenders, we don't give them access to the site anymore.
Aidan, are there any of those examples from the different news organizations? Were there any red flags that you heard that you thought might be best practice, or great examples?
I must say that it's a very good range of options here, and I think what's been talked about, which is the question of registration, is very important, so that you're able to sort of make sure you can trace people is absolutely vital. And I think respect for self-policing is also very important, because I think the notion that we have faith in the community to be able to come back and correct material that's unacceptable and so on. But I have to say, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but this is very much a panel of the good guys. It's very much a panel of people who know what these issues are about, are very sensitive to it, and actually, in some cases, have the resources to be able to put in place systems which are going to act as good health checks in terms of the comments we have. Now, one of the difficulties we have across the media scene is one, there's a massive problem about financing good moderation systems. I mean, because it's expensive. When you get lots and lots of comments, it's expensive to be able to deal with it. And often, of course, what you're dealing with is post-moderation and not pre-moderation. So we have a sort of real problem that there are media organizations, even some of the reputable media organizations, that don't have the resources to put in place what I would regard as safe systems to make sure that when we're dealing with issues, for instance, related to religion, which can actually often spark off serious confrontation. And when we're talking about this isn't just exchanges, intemperate language being used between groups of people. We're talking about the capacity to generate hatred and violence on quite a scale. So, I mean, I think there's a problem here. I think there's some very good examples here of systems that can be put in place. What I'm sort of scratching my head and thinking about is, how do you take this good practice and multiply it and make it available, and actually also make it attractive to media organizations that frankly are much more interested in clicks than sometimes in quality, and that's pretty dangerous. So I think my immediate response is that all of this is very good, which we need to package up and we need to put it out there before the media, but we have a sort of massive problem in trying to deal with a media industry that in many places is in such bad shape. It actually is, it's allowing quality to be shredded, not just in the comments, unfortunately, but also in some of the journalism. So there's a whole range of problems that I think we have to deal with.
When EFRA discusses some best practices, which we'll talk about in a bit, but before we do that, I'm wondering, why do we even bother with this? Why do we put these comments up, allow commenting, when it does require so much time? I'm being a bit of a devil's advocate. I think it's very important for freedom of expression. I think a lot of commenters view it as their right to be able to chime in, and often they can provide useful information for the journalists doing the reporting. But is it important to your brand? Why have you decided not to turn off comments entirely? Whoever wants to answer this from among the news organizations.
Yeah, I'll start. I think this is very important. I mean, Malaysia Kini had always prided itself in being like the alternative We're not mainstream. We provide news which would not normally come out in mainstream media. Our company policy is that we stand by good governance. We're against human right violations. So, we have a lot of public support, and the people's view is important. And if we don't allow them to give their voice to a particular issue, then it's very much I would say we're telling the viewers this is what's happening, this is our view. But here we're giving the readers a chance to comment. We're not stemming their voice. We're not curtailing their freedom to have an opinion, whether we like their opinion or not. If it's expressed professionally, it makes sense. If it contributes to the debate, this is how a story can be really important. This is how it goes from just being a news story, oh, the government has done this, or this NGO has done this, and it becomes something that people talk about, they share on Facebook, they debate, among themselves, and this is how a story grows. This is how you actually have impact. If, on the other hand, if we say that, oh, this is too much effort, and we're just going to cut off readers' comments, this could have a bad backlash. People could start saying that, oh, well, what is Malaysia Kini trying to hide? Why are they so afraid of what the people have to say? And it just defeats what, as a news organization, what we're trying to do.
Interesting. Anyone else?
If I could jump in there. Could I get in on this? For us, it was slightly different. There was, with the rise of interactive media, of course, there was more and more demand from customers, from our users, to be able to comment, either in terms of a debate or in terms of contributions to stories, saying, you didn't say this, you should have said that, or why don't you follow this path? And so there was, for us, a balance, because we're an enormous news agency, and there's so many different issues going on. We had at one point 50 blogs going, for example, and there were also comments on individual news stories. So it got to the point where they had to balance it and say, well, what is our actual purpose? And the initial idea was, well, we should be out there and have meets and things like that. We kind of limited that, because it's not really our purpose as an international news agency, which is actually also heavily a financial news agency. That's the largest part of Reuters. We're not there to run a debating club. We are there to inform people. We do want to have the feedback from them. I learned quite a few very interesting things, especially early on in interaction with users. But at a certain point you say, we're not running a debating club, and that's why I think we have what seems like stricter rules for our filtering. Also, we're so big that we had more of a capacity to do that.
Interesting. I'm wondering from Kevin and Tiffany specifically, since their sites both deal exclusively with religion, issues of religion and politics and society, what type of religion stories are you seeing that generate the worst comments or the most egregious affronts to other users, to the subjects being mentioned, to just people in general?
Well, I can start. I know most recently, I think some of the stories that we've had on Islam, we ran a story on Narendra Modi in India, and those kind of stories that are already dealing with religious violence, like I monitor those comments really closely. I've also seen, probably not surprisingly, a lot of negative comments on stories that we do about women in religion and sort of feminist leanings, or maybe more traditional women's perspectives. So those are the ones that I tend to see flagged a little bit more.
Yeah, at least for RNS, probably the three areas that get us the most sparks, if you want to call it that. First would be anything about gay and lesbian issues, because it inevitably devolves into a debate about what the Bible says or doesn't say about homosexuality. And also, as Tiffany was saying, Islam and Muslims, and then also Mormons, actually, again, tends to oftentimes get sidetracked by a scriptural debate about whether or not the Mormon faith is true or not. You know, it's interesting. We have sort of certain groups of commenters that are kind of different camps, and we have a very vocal atheist community that likes to comment on our stuff. We're actually the only news organization that has a full-time staffer dedicated to the atheist and non-belief beat, so we have a fairly sizable following there. But we also have, curiously, a group of really arch-conservative Catholics who love to try to poke holes in some of the more liberal churches, Episcopalians or Presbyterians or whatever, and say, well, they're all just false churches, so that's why they're having these problems. So it's interesting to me that we have kind of different camps of people that tend to gravitate towards our site. Most of them tend to be pretty civil. I would say the atheist contingent tends to be the most volatile, I guess.
I'm hoping some of the news organizations can provide specific examples of when they've had a comment that they really had to think about for a while, to meditate on whether or not to take it down or to leave it up when it dealt with issues of hatred or religious intolerance, and what you ultimately did with that comment. Anyone who's got an example?
Sure, I can start. It just goes back to the story I just mentioned a minute ago about in India when the election was going on and Modi looked like he was going to win, and we had a correspondent in India that wrote a piece for us. And we got some pretty interesting comments, but they were just people expressing their views, either pro-Modi or against him, so those, of course, I left. But there was one that seemed pretty like it was trying to incite some sort of response. And since the piece was dealing with the legacy of religious violence in India, I wanted to be super careful. And I was able to actually go into our system and see that this guy was actually posting that comment on multiple places on our site and kind of all over the internet. So I was able to see through Disqus, he was basically just copying and pasting it. And he had been blacklisted by a number of sites. You can either whitelist someone or blacklist them. So that made it a little bit easier, like, okay, this guy is kind of a crank. I'm just going to go ahead and hide the comment. I'm not going to delete it. And I was able to, after he kept reposting things, just to block him from our site.
We had go ahead, Tom.
Okay, we had a real spate of difficult comments back in 2008, I think it was, when there was the attack in Mumbai in India on the Taj Mahal Hotel and the Chabad headquarters there, the Chabad House, and a few other places. And one article that sparked them off was a piece saying that 9 of the 10 were killed. Their bodies were first brought to the city morgue, and then, since they were Pakistanis and Muslims, the city government turned to the Muslim community and said, can you please bury them in a Muslim cemetery? And the Bombay Muslim Council, or whatever it's called, refused to do that. They said these people are a disgrace to Islam. They're not Muslims if they do something like that. We have them in our cemetery. So they stayed in the morgue, and it was found out after a while. Wrote a story about it. So of course, if you want some discussion, you say, well, what should happen with these bodies? And we had some of the most disgusting sort of examples that people were saying, oh, the easier ones was take them right to the border and just dump them there, or cut them into little pieces and have the birds come, the vultures come and eat them, and things like this. And they came, there were so many, and they were so different. Some of them got through the general moderation, and I take a look at them and I just say, wait a minute, is this a crime? For example, all religions have cremation, or most religions have cremation. Certainly Hinduism has cremation, and Muslims don't like it, but in India, cremation is quite normal. So if they say burn the bodies, do you take that? But if they say cut them up, well, they don't take it. It depended sometimes, especially the ones dealing with burning the bodies. Didn't let too many of them through, but sometimes they said, okay, fine, that's an Indian point of view, and we could let that go.
Did you have one as well, Kevin?
Yeah, so we had an incident last year, and without going into the specifics, but it was basically, it started with a a blog post that we hosted on our site that was directed at a public figure. The public figure, took some issue with what was said or written, and basically, wrote in and say, I really don't like this piece, you should take it down. And we said, no, it's free speech, we're going to leave it up. But then what happened was the commenter sort of took this thing over and it went viral. And a couple other outlets picked up the publication, and then their comments went viral. And what happened was the person who was kind of targeted in this original piece was reading the comments on other sites and then blaming us for it because we, produced the original material. And on our site, of course, we found some of the troublesome comments and deleted them right away because they strayed over the line and violated our policy. But the problem was that we couldn't control what other people were saying on other sites about our story. And I would imagine that that's probably something that other places have run into. At the end of the day, when we were threatened with legal action for defamation of character, we ended up taking the entire post down, comments and all. Not because we were threatened with action, but just because it had gotten so out of control that there was just no way to rescue the situation. So we ended up spiking the whole thing. But it was, it was kind of an alarming episode of putting something on the internet and then just watching people run wild with it. And once it's out there, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube.
That's interesting you raised the legal questions around defamation. Libel is often also a big issue, and we had a huge problem in the UK with libel tourism. Then there's issues around different definitions of hate speech in different countries, Holocaust denial in parts of Europe, blasphemy issues in many places around the world. Have any of you had to deal with these legal issues in your comments?
Well,
No, we haven't had to. Oh, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no. I can't think of a clear example, but in Malaysia, we don't really have separation of church and state. So there is a chance that almost any story could turn into a debate online about religion. If it's about the Malay community against the Chinese community, then it would very well, the comment could very well evolve into something about Islam and Christianity. So we're always having to face, similar to what Tom said earlier about, having to judge the sensitivity of a comment, like, oh, it's made by an Indian about cremation. Is it really, does that constitute hate speech? So we're always having to judge that. When we had a case recently, a few months back, revolving the use of the word Allah, where they were trying to prevent a Catholic newspaper from using the term, saying that it was exclusive to Islam. You can imagine the comments just, it became all about Islam versus Christianity. And then we had to really, that really tested, as far as I was concerned, how do we judge what is a hate speech? Because half the time, it may not be something we like to hear, we like to read, but he is making a good point about a particular religion, like, oh, they say, for example, Islam, this, or, in Christianity, you must understand this. So, he's making a generalized statement, and it may not be sometimes necessarily something that's very nice, but it's relevant to the debate. But at the same time, we need to make sure that in our attempt to give everyone a voice, we don't get sued. And not to say that because then we're just so afraid of a government legal suit for sedition or for defamation or, mischief or whatever, that we don't want to give people a voice. But if we get sued too often, then it's going to actually prevent us from doing our job of reporting. So that's where, monitoring hate speech, it becomes really tricky.
Did you have anything, Aiden, you wanted to say on that front, especially in regards to issues of self-censorship, as Darshini was just mentioning?
Well, I mean, I think that this question of the definition of hate speech is a massive problem. Just because someone says something outrageous doesn't mean that it's automatically hate speech, and nor does it mean that it's automatically news or worth posting. I think there are ways of testing hate speech. That is to say, what is the intention of the person who's speaking? Are they deliberately attempting to generate intense hatred or incite violence? You have to also consider what is the impact of the way that the expression is made. Is it likely to sort of inspire a strong response, or is it just going to be sort of regarded as absurd and ridiculous, and so on? So I think it's very important to ensure that we are very conscious of the need to examine the context in which speech is being made. Sometimes people are intemperate because they're merely responding to something terrible that's happened, and people tend to can lose their heads. They can say things which they will regret tomorrow morning, and it's not their intention to sort of do something terrible. So we have to be sort of very careful about this. So I'm always sort of very conscious of the problem of the lack of a good international definition of what hate speech is. Makes life very difficult, because it means that we all, as journalists, and I suppose also the authorities and the police and so on, we end up being the people who make a judgment call about what constitutes hate speech. And also, we have to recognize that it varies from country to country. In the United States, there's a very high tolerance level of speech because of the country's democratic traditions. In other countries, there are. It's very difficult. It's very different indeed. I mean, it's very difficult to talk about religion in countries like Pakistan or in Egypt or other places where these matters are extremely delicate. So, I think the issue here is that I don't think there's a legal solution to this problem of sort of trying to create more tolerance in public discourse about issues related to religion. What we have to do is to try to find a way in which we can tone things down when they need to be toned down, and just remove the most dangerous speech. And that's actually very difficult, because we need resources to do that, we need well-trained people to do that, and we also need an audience which is, receptive to our ideas. All of these are massive problems.
And on the journalist side, it's a bit easier to train journalists how to report responsibly and ethically, but it's very difficult, I'd say almost impossible, to actually train commenters how to do that. We can put our terms of service more prominently in front of them, would be one way, but if people want to spew hatred under a pseudonym, they're going to go ahead and do so. Let's actually talk about that briefly, the role of anonymity. Aidan mentioned he was glad to hear that quite a few groups had a registration process. I've written in the past about the need for anonymity in many contexts for different groups, for them to be able to express themselves on some of these very sensitive issues. How have you decided to sort of balance this need for anonymity and kind of preserving a more conducive civil space for a community discussion on some of your sites?
Well, I think on our site, I think it's it's just important to have some sort of barrier to entry, like some sort of process where people have to kind of log in. And so, as a lot of you guys have said, we have where people can use a username. So if they need to be more anonymous, they can, but we're still going to be able to see kind of their email and their contact information if we need to. But a high number actually choose to use their real names, which is interesting. But I think for safety reasons, if someone did want to be anonymous, they would either not post or they would use a username.
The question of registration is important. When we first started out, we didn't have any registration, and the number of trolls coming on, I used to call them drive-by shootings, was just enormous. It took so much time just to click and say, no, dump this one, delete that one. And so once we brought in the registration, it was wonderful. I felt like, only 3 comments today rather than 50? So that itself, I think, was the biggest step.
I mean, can I add to that? I think Tom's right there. That I have a sense that there is a growing awareness among users that actually registration is not some great denial of rights. That actually it's a sensible and useful way to be part of the public conversation. And that's not to say that we shouldn't very strongly promote the right to anonymity. For certain marginalized and vulnerable groups, it's absolutely essential that anonymity is protected. That's clearly the case. But we have to make a distinction between the application of that right to people who need to be protected, and actually generally just allowing a sort of a right to anonymity to exist abroad. I think increasingly that notion is being rejected by people who want to be involved in public conversations about all sorts of different issues.
One of our viewers is asking why we even bother hosting comments on our site when we all have social media platforms where we can do the same thing. Why right below the stories on our sites?
Well, the easy answer to that is it makes money. The fact of the matter is, for many media, comments are an absolutely essential part of their strategy for disseminating their information, because the more clicks they get, the more likelihood that algorithms are going to kick in, which will provide advertising on their sites. So many media companies see it as absolutely essential part of their sort of financial strategy to have as open an information space as possible to actually encourage participation. So that problem about the predominance of clicks over content and the impact that has on quality of journalism and media is a real one. So the answer to the question is it's because it can actually be a revenue generator. That's why media do encourage comments.
So we all have some sort of comment moderation policies, but of the 4 news organizations represented, are you actively moderating comments on your social media sites?
Yeah. Well, we have a person whose sole task is to handle social network, and part of that responsibility will be to moderate comments on social network, Twitter, Facebook, especially. Yeah.
Okay.
It's definitely. I mean, sorry, just that use of social media. People's use of social media to get news is growing, so that's definitely something that needs to be looked at. Sorry.
Yeah, one thing that we've noticed is that with the growth of social media, now there are more and more outlets. For example, when we started with blogs, all the focus was on the blogs themselves. And so there was a lot more interaction. Then Twitter came along, and a lot of the shorter, obviously, type of comments and all just migrated over to Twitter. With Facebook, it's the same thing. And in fact, I find it interesting. I end up moderating very few comments anymore because we have several filters before that. What has happened is that some people have migrated over to Facebook. I tend to have more conversations on Facebook than in our comments box.
Interesting. I mentioned that Cherian George, who is the Associate Professor of Journalism at Hong Kong Baptist University, and who's written quite a bit on hate speech online and how to deal with it in the past. He sent in a quote, and it's actually a question for the panelists to mull, so I'll just read it. Community moderation, so we've been talking about this a bit, community moderation, so relying on users to blow the whistle, is one labor-saving approach in commenting and moderating comments. But this can be abused and turned into a heckler's veto. Is the more realistic solution to simply close comments for stories with a known risk of generating hate speech? He said he's sort of leaning that way. When you know a story is just going to generate a lot of vitriol, as Aidan mentioned earlier, should we just be closing those comment sections before they even go up? And are some of your organizations doing that?
I would say no, and actually fairly strongly no, because obviously all journalists and all journalist organizations act as a sort of gatekeeper. We give people the news that we think we should give them. But I don't think that we should be in the role of deciding, well, this one's going to be too hot to handle, so we're not going to do that, or this is going to be a lame story, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, I think it's really up for the audience to decide what is and isn't, you know, a hot topic. Yeah, I think on this sort of general question of why have comments at all, and I think it gets to this, part of what we do at RNS, or at least what we hope we do, is to do two things. One is work on religious literacy, so educating people about religion, its role in public life, and hopefully other religions, so that, you know, people will learn something about Islam or Mormons or what have you. But the other thing that we try to do is offer a place for civil discourse about these hot button topics, and that's where you know, self-policing comes in. And you'd be surprised, you know, commenters will call out other commenters for, you know, loony comments, and they can shut somebody down pretty quickly if they want. But we also, you know, try to make sure that that's the kind of environment that we're hosting. So I think, you know, at the end of the day, our role as journalists is to, you know, kind of toss the question out there and see what resonates with people, but then ensure that we're not cutting off the debate prematurely, but also that we're fostering an environment where people feel safe to express what's on their mind.
I wonder if I could just respond to that, Kevin. I mean, I agree with you, and my natural sentiment is absolutely to say the open door is what we should have, and it's always the case. But I think there are some stories where we live in a world where sort of media-savvy groups are very aware of their capacity to intervene on really contentious issues. Now, when The Guardian decides to close all comments on issues related, for instance, to its reporting of the Gaza conflict, they do that knowing very well that we're not here dealing with a story in which there is, you know, in which people have got something to say, in which they want to add something to clarify or to elaborate or to enhance the quality of the story. It's opening the door to a terrible fight between well-organized, disciplined groups of extremists who have got the capacity to intervene and do so in such a way that will create chaos and actually completely divert from the journalistic purpose of trying to provide context and clarity in really important and difficult stories. So I think there has to be a time where we ourselves have to draw red lines and say, look, there's a public interest here in this story, which means that we can't allow ourselves to be held hostage by groups who will want to take advantage of technology to try to close it down.
Would anyone else like to respond?
I'd like to say, I think that's a very good point. Excuse me. We sometimes find ourselves just overwhelmed with the number of comments. You just can't handle them. And, you know, there is a certain number of people we have devoted to moderating these things. And sometimes, and I've had some cases that were not contentious at all, but just had so many comments that after a while you just had to close it down because it was taking over the work of the moderating desk in Toronto, or the editors who were being then asked, okay, can we, you know, would you moderate these? So the option has to be there. I don't think it looks good. So I think in the end, you know, I prefer not to do it, but it has to be there.
Tiffany?
I mean, I think for me it would be similar to what Kevin said. It would, I err on the side of not shutting down comments, but I do sort of reserve the veto option. And that was how, when I was having discussions with our partners before we launched, where I was really pushing for comments and they were a little nervous about it. And I just said, the other option is if we ever have a problem, we can always close the comments or just stop new ones from coming in. So our comment section actually closes after a certain amount of time, and I forget what it is now, but after about a month or two, new comments can't be posted on an old article. So that option could just be put into place sooner if we really ran into an issue. But so far, we really haven't.
Yeah, it's a matter of sort of, if you decide to shut it down before the post even goes up, you're sort of making a decision of what you think will happen before it actually happens, rather than acting after. And it seems like all of us have a post-publication model, except for if there's some automated filtering for keywords that come through. We've got about 10 minutes left. This report that Aidan and I have referenced a few times did have some suggested best practices for moderating online comments, and I think we've hit on a lot of them. I'll just read through some of the highlights very quickly. So the first is to publish clear guidelines for commenters, terms of service, community guidelines. Seems like most of us have those. To hire a community manager to keep on top of some of the conversations. Sounds like we're doing that as well. To encourage journalists to actually participate in the conversations, unless there's a specific reason not to. Are you managers telling your journalists to chime in?
No.
I've done that on occasion. There have been a few times where people are speaking directly to the author in the comments in really smart ways, and so I've reached out just to let the writer know, hey, people are talking to you in the comments and asking you questions. If you want to chime in, it's completely up to you, and if you don't, please don't. Because we all know, as a writer, sometimes you just want to completely ignore the commenters, so I kind of leave it up to them, but if I see people are providing really smart conversations that maybe they want to join in on, I invite them to.
Anyone else?
You know, we urge all of our reporters, especially the ones who are full-time staff, to keep an eye on their comments and to wade in as appropriate. What we've found is a lot of times it offers us the chance to explain to readers why we did something the way we did. Somebody will comment and say, well, you really should have quoted this person, or, I don't understand why you hit this point or ignored that point or whatever, and it gives us a chance to start a dialogue about why we do what we do and how we do it. And oftentimes what I find is that, readers sort of appreciate that kind of behind the veil sort of look. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, but, it does, I think, give us a chance also to measure what we're producing against what people are expecting. So, sometimes people will, say you're completely missing the story here, or you've got this fact wrong, or you've misspelled somebody's name, or whatever it is. But it also, it gives us a chance to say, I never thought of the story that way, and maybe we follow up on that down the road. So I think, in its best form, it can foster a really good interaction between the readers and the reporters. That said, I also know that my reporters have much more to do than to just keep an eye on their comments all day. So, tricky balance.
The other suggestions in this report were to find ways to surface the most valuable comments, which it sounds like the platform Tiffany's using, Disqus, does quite well, and I know Facebook integration does quite well. To give feedback and educate your readers when you're censoring, as Kevin just mentioned, we do at RNS. To seek legal advice as an editor and share that with staff, which is very important around some of these, obviously, defamation and libel issues, but then also the blasphemy issues we mentioned. And then the last one, which maybe we can discuss for a bit, is to seek to protect minority opinions and to amplify minority views. How can we actually do that in practice, and do you think it's important to do so?
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things we have to do is to encourage minority participation best we can. I think one of the useful ways journalistically we could respond to this whole discussion is to make it a part of the journalistic process. I mean, I think, as is being suggested here, raising awareness among our audience is actually very important. So I think, say, for example, once a week or once a month, doing our own report effectively to the audience about these are the sort of comments that we've received over the past months. Some of them were good, some of them were bad, some of them were interesting, some of them we could highlight. So we turn this sort of business, which can be tedious and really too difficult, of moderating into a sort of discussion about quality of information and how and responsibility in the use of information. I think that can be really useful, and in that process it gives us an opportunity to editorialize and to do stories about minority opinions, about opinions that perhaps aren't getting the sort of play that it would be useful for them to have. So I think looking for a sort of journalistic response as how do we fit this debate into our existing news agenda might be helpful and might be one way of, just encouraging more minority participation.
Other suggestions?
If I can just add to that, one of the things that Malaysia Kini does is that we tend to highlight our user comments. So we have any day between 2 to 5 sort of compilation of readers' comments to a particular story, and we call it Your Say. So this empowers, the readers to comment, and gives us a chance to pick out some of the really intelligent comments, or some of those that give a bit more background to a particular story or a different viewpoint to a particular story. And this also allows us to kind of highlight maybe a minority viewpoint that you may not necessarily be given a chance to hear about in a particular story.
Are there any other? Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that's a really good idea and something that we should think about doing here.
Are there any other last-minute pertinent issues we really need to discuss, or other best practice suggestions that you can provide from your newsroom, or great organizations beyond the 4 or 5 of us represented here that you think we should look to for, or the viewers should look to for inspiration and guidance in moderating these comments?
I would just highlight, in talking about this, I was looking for examples of what other groups do, and I think, and I've seen different versions of this in different places. The one that stuck out of my mind is at Sojourners, which is sojo.net. It's a progressive Christian publication here in the States, but they have what they call a comment community covenant. That appears at the bottom of their stories above the comments. So before you can comment, you're supposed to see this. They do theirs in a particular way, but it says by commenting, a person is basically saying that they agree with this covenant, and it says that they will express themselves with civility, courtesy, and respect, without insults, mocks, or slander, and I will not exaggerate other people's beliefs, and I will report comments that violate these principles. But the bottom line is that it's a very visible reminder of what the expectations on the news organization's side are, but also the it's an implicit agreement by the commenters that this is what they're going to abide by, and if they don't, then they can be banned. And the more I think of it, the more I think we're going to be implementing at least some version of this, hopefully at Religion News Service.
It would be interesting to see whether that has an effect different from the types of agreements that you seem to have and we have that are there but are not that visible. I mean, if somebody looked at our agreement, you could see it was written by corporate lawyers and you would hardly say anything probably. But I don't know whether Sojourners has a more positive result because of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but definitely would be worth checking out with them. And I think it's it's probably not perfect, and I don't know that there is any kind of perfect solution, but I think it's something I think that news organizations, but also the readers, the commenters, should probably try to aim for.
Any other quick final words, Darshini, Tiffany, Aiden?
I just think that it's, as mentioned earlier, it's to 100% to effectively moderate all comment. It's very, very difficult. It's very expensive. You need to hire a huge team. But I think that from what I'm hearing from everyone, everyone's doing the best they can. They seem to. I think everyone's well aware of the issues, and that's the most important thing. You know the limitations and you know the issue, and the industry is growing. Users themselves, how they accept news and how they perceive news and they respond to it, that is changing. So I think that, to me, that's a positive sign. That everyone's just becoming more aware of this issue. So that's good to note.
I think that's right, and I must say that the way that Darshini talks about how Malaysia Kini is doing it is great, and I think Tiffany's reference to the question of the use of systems that are there, that using the technology itself to help us get through this process is very important. And we don't all have the resources that Tom has, and I know that's not as much as he would like to have, but it certainly is better. But it seems to me that some ideas have come up here which suggest to me that Darshini's right, that actually we are doing the best we can, and that things are getting slowly better. I mean, I think that's right, and we can find solutions. But I mean, I do worry about the state of the broader industry, and I think there are sort of real challenges there. But I think the more that we can spread the messages that we've got, for instance, in this small panel about practical action that's being taken, that's beginning to work, that's delivering results, it's encouraging more responsibility. The more we can spread that message, then I think we're more likely to succeed.
Final word to Tiffany, if you have one.
Sure. Well, I just think you know, comments are a part of fostering debate, and like Kevin and others have mentioned, you know, make sure that we have religious literacy. And I think that when comments are done right, they can be really illuminating. And I know there's a lot of communities when you watch the debate happening, and it seems like it's changing people's minds and kind of opening them up. I mean, that's what we all want. It doesn't always happen, and it's not perfect. It's messy, but I think it's worthwhile.
I agree. So thank you all, thank you participants, thank you viewers, and thanks to Religion News Service and to Google for sponsoring this event. So this will be posted on religionnews.com and religionlink.com. We're also going to be writing a report, a guide, advising editors how to best counter hateful sentiments where religion is an element, based on this conversation and based on other independent research, and that we'll be putting up on religionlink.com before the end of the month. And you can track, I mentioned we're doing a series of stories on hate speech, religious freedom, religious intolerance, and religious hatred, which you can find at religionnews.com. So thanks again for everyone. And
thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for having me.
Thanks a lot.